You're a speed reader.
Well, I have to admit that I was staying up for
S-U-Z-I-E?
S-U-S-I-E. I watched that video of her playing today.
Oh.
That was perfect.
He's my oldest great-grandson. Right?
And your grandpa.
You're welcome. Okay, we're doing a book signing for my latest book in Chicken House Chronicles titled Barbara. It's about my mother's struggle with mental illness through the 1930s and 1940s. When she passed away, we discovered it locked in our chicken house up on the farm in Nebish, Minnesota. Just mountains of family history. The earliest letter that I found was written by a guy named John Olmsted, and he marched in the Revolutionary War. He was in the Connecticut militia in 1781.
Where are you now?
We're at the Watermark History Center in Bemidji, Minnesota, and we're just doing a book signing. Yeah, looking forward to a good crowd. And this, I'd like to introduce Dr. Peterson. He wrote the foreword for the book.
Okay.
Just been an amazing help with the book. He went through and gave me a clinical edit and really tightened up the book and made it a much better book.
You want to add anything to that?
Well, I would. Wendell has taken on a task that I don't think very many people would, and that is to understand the very difficult childhood that he endured with a parent that was severely impaired with a very unusual medical psychiatric diagnosis. And most of us, I think, would have not preferred to go there. But Wendell did an incredible job of researching all of the difficulties and the wonderful talents that his mother displayed during her life and put it together in a very amazing historical account of her life and all the difficulties therein. And he even got the right diagnosis, a very obscure diagnosis. Borderline personality disorder is not a very easy diagnosis to establish in any patient. And Wendell did a remarkable job of figuring that one out. So my hat's off to Wendell for taking the unusual job of bringing this experience to all of us. And it's wonderful. The book is great.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.
Take care. And here we go, Diane.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Welcome everyone tonight. The Watermark Art Center's Spoken Word Committee is pleased to present author Wendell Hatfield the launch of his book Barbara, the third in the Chicken House Chronicles. It has been over 3.5 years since the launch of Ponds here at Watermark, so we're grateful to be able to host him again. I would like to thank all of you for coming tonight and just give everyone a quick reminder to check your cell phones to make sure they're on mute before they're reading. And then now I would like to present Dr. William Peterson, who wrote the foreword for Barbara, to say a few words.
My name is Bill Peterson, and I'm a retired family doctor from this area, retired 2 years ago. And it's a great honor to be here tonight to introduce a friend and a great servant of our community, Wendell Hatfield. I met Wendell as I was fortunate to become his family doctor in 2013 when I started my last medical practice at the VA clinic here in Bemidji. And it was really interesting to meet a real writer and get to know Wendell and his experience as a person and a veteran. And so Wendell She came to writing in middle age and developed some writing techniques through some of his educators at Bemidji State University, but in many ways Wendell is a self-taught author. And I think his books are even more amazing to me, understanding that that's the case. And so tonight we're celebrating the release of Wendell's fourth book, and it's a book about his mother, Barbara. And Barbara was a remarkable woman in many ways. Wendell's going to talk about Barbara. She had, among other things, a very serious psychiatric illness, and later it became known that she suffered from borderline personality disorder. Borderline personality disorder is not an uncommon but a fairly obscure medical psychiatric diagnosis. And most patients with it come to a diagnosis after exclusion of many other more common conditions, such as major depressive disorder, anxiety disorder, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and a number of others. If you're worried you have borderline personality disorder, you probably in fact do not. Wendell provided a sheet with the diagnostic criterion of borderline personality disorder for your benefit, and that's not the reason he's here. He's not here to talk about that medical diagnosis. He's here to talk about the journey that led him to tell the story, the remarkable story of his mother, and the journey she had through borderline personality disorder her entire adult life. That affected him, it affected her family members, and it affected anyone they came in contact with. It's my great honor to welcome Wendell Hatfield to talk about his journey in writing this amazing book.
When you came in on the laptop computer out there was a video playing. It was Barbara playing the Old Masters. I videotaped that in 1988 out at the old farmhouse in Nevis. And that's Nevis, up by Red Lake Nation, not Nevis, like correct. More than once people have been confused about that. But there's so many people I want to just acknowledge tonight. The Watermark crew, thank you for setting this up and organizing it. David Blom for filming tonight. It's just, I met David 12 years ago, 11 years ago. He did an interview for me when my first book came out, 20 Jungle Rivers, my Vietnam memoir. So many people contributed to making Barbara a reality. My wife Patty has had so much patience over the past decade as I worked on this and went on a few journeys through New York and Illinois, doing research and meeting family. My sister Laurel, Dr. Will Peterson, naturally. Our writers group, one of them made it tonight. Greg, thank you for your contributions. And Emily Enger. Emily's just been instrumental in the technical aspects of the work that I've been doing. And I have two local ladies, Jean Humanek and Marianne Wilmack, that just took an interest in my project, and one of the ladies is here tonight. I had these letters written in a foreign language, and I'm an retired butcher. Okay? When I saw these, I knew my mother had been in Poland in the 1930s, and so I assumed that these letters she had from her fiance were written in Polish. I guess that's a natural assumption. Well, anyway, I showed it to Marianne, and she said, "Oh, these are Latin." So she said, let me talk to my friend Rudy, and was his name in Germany, and she emailed the Latin letters to Rudy, and a few days later I had the English translation. I mention that just to give you an insight. My mother was so incredibly intelligent. She was fluent in Latin and in French, and she had a working use of Spanish and German beyond her English. And a few other people that I did a horrendous amount of research on this book. We grew up listening to our mother's stories, and we knew that our roots kind of are in the Washington state area. And Barbara would often kind of brag about her wealth. And her maternal family was in Everett, Washington, the Frat family. Well, today, the Frat mansion is owned by Sandra Cope and Walt Gillette. And they are kind of curators who have made it their life project in retirement of reconstructing my great-grandparents' lives. And Sandra and Walt have been just instrumental. We've exchanged hundreds of messages and documents over the past decade. Another person that in the mid-1940s, my mother kind of broke away from her parents and went silent. And so all the documents I had in the chicken house, I had a lot of questions, and I was at a loss when I was working on my Barbara manuscript. And I started reaching out. I knew she was on welfare in New York and out in Nevada. She lived for a while. Well, I sent out lots of inquiries and either didn't get replies or FOIA requests were refused. And on a long shot, I sent a request to 3rd District Court in Las Cruces, New Mexico, where her first husband got a divorce. And this lady, Jody Delgado, sent me 42 pages of information from 70 years ago. This lady took her time and dug in, and it was amazing information. There included 2 depositions that were done on my mother. Just opened doors that I never would have dreamed about. And the third person that I would just want to acknowledge, a man named David Schmidt. And I'm going to come back to David a little bit later here in my talk. And needless to say, I think most of you might know that through DNA discoveries, I found my paternal family. And in 2019, my sister Lauren and I drove out to New York. My wife Patty was recovering from shoulder surgery. Spit that out. And she couldn't make the trip, but she insisted that we go. But my new siblings, all of them almost live on Long Island. Yvonne, Louie, Larry, Guy, Mike, Gene. Without you guys and Yvonne, there would be no part 3 to Barbara, and there would be no resolution to this story. So thank you. And Barbara, it's to summarize it, people ask me, well, what's the book about? And I guess it's a story of one woman's struggle with mental illness through the 1930s and 40s, and her parents' anguish trying to understand what troubled their daughter. Part 3 documents my search for my paternal family. I made all these elaborate notes and whatnot, and I realized the book covers a century of time. Barbara was born, excuse me. Barbara was born in 1920, and here we are 101 years later. So I want to just read a little bit of the introduction to this book. The spring of 2010, a few months after Barbara died, my sister Laurel and I unlocked the chicken house door on a family homestead near Nebish, Minnesota. When my grandmother Elsie Phillips died in 1984, Barbara had her belongings shipped from Seattle, Washington to the farm. They were first stored in the hayloft of the dairy barn, but after a windstorm blew the barn down, the storm-damaged contents were transferred to the chicken house, and Barbara put a padlock on the 80-year-old building. And I think my brother Danny helped move those old documents. Thank you. Thank you for not just throwing them in the trash pile. From 1991 onward, after that padlock was placed on the chicken house door, Barbara would become hysterical if any of her 8 children, her 9th child, Randy, had died in an airplane crash in 1978, suggested unlocking and exploring the contents. The morning Laura and I removed the padlock in 2010, remnants of our grandmother's calico curtains and wool blankets sagged from broken chicken purchase. Manure, straw, and feathers littered the frost-heaved concrete floor. Mold spores and dust that we'd awakened danced in sunbeams that filtered through fly-scat-coated windows. The stench of mouse urine and decay permeated the coop. Laura brought protective masks. We spent 2 days methodically working our way through the building. Donned in masks and protective gloves, we started in one corner and began sifting through our family history. The first thing we discovered was my grandmother's urn, tucked beneath a mildewed chair cushion, wedged in a corner outside the chicken feed hopper. First edition books, many signed by the author, dry rotted and manure-crusted nesting boxes. I discovered a 1926 leather-bound edition of Penrod, 1914, by Ruth Tarkenton, a silk bookmark dangled from page 58. Beneath a heap of old clothing and newspapers, we discovered several sealed boxes containing the bulk of letters and diaries. There were thousands of documents. The earliest was a letter dated 1822, written by David Olmsted, who had been a soldier in the Connecticut Provisional Regiment in 1781. And as I mentioned, that frat mansion out in Everett, that was my great-grandmother's maiden name, Olmsted. I take that back, that's not correct. That was my grandfather's mother's name. Anyway, it was obvious that Barbara had never looked at the documents. Bundles of letters held by grill rubber bands remained in good condition. Some of the packets were sorted by author, some by year, some by event. There were 7 World War II V-mail messages written by my grandfather while I was on convoy duty in North Atlantic. My grandmother was a prolific writer. We discovered reams of her rough drafts and correspondence from people who had replied to her letters. I have a small library of 1940s mental health books and my grandmother's lists of questions for the psychiatrist who treated her 2 daughters. There were scrapbooks from their European tour in 1937-38. Diaries and pictures spanned decades from the 1890s to the 1980s. So one of the documents that we found in the chicken house was a letter that was a letter draft. Before computers, as some of our generation know, people wrote rough drafts of letters, and if they were to important people, you would go through and revise them, and you might have 2 or 3 drafts, okay? And so my grandmother saved rough drafts. I have rough drafts that she wrote to Governor Dewey of New York, to King Leopold and the Netherlands, and a few other people. This is one that she wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt, the spring of 1951. And I did some research, and I kind of figured out there might be a connection. Eleanor Roosevelt was involved. My grandmother was a Vassar College alumna, and I figured out that Eleanor Roosevelt was involved in a summer program at Vassar. It was called a euthenics program. What it was designed for is to teach young women in the 30s and 40s how to be mothers, okay? And my grandmother was always very involved in Vassar after she graduated, and so that's where I think maybe there was a slim connection. Anyway, here's the letter draft, just an excerpt from it. The full letter actually is in my Pond book. Dear Miss Roosevelt, As one mother to another mother, I address you. My daughter has S, she abbreviated actually, it's a draft, schizophrenia. She is the mother of 4 children, 3 sons and a daughter. She has been missing for over a year. If you know S, you know that this is dangerous both for herself and her dear children. She was an advanced student studying on scholarships to be a concert pianist when she was blitzed out of Europe by the Second World War. Disconsolate over her music career being ruined by Hitler, she went to work in an airplane factory and married the man who worked next to her in the factory. The psychological disorder developed, and he deserted her after the first child was born. The second husband got pneumonia. She tried suicide, and that was her second documented suicide attempt. My grandmother Elsie at times was an unreliable narrator, and she would adjust history to fit her narrative. As she said in this letter, that Barbara developed a psychological problem in the 1939, 1940s. But in the chicken house, there was a stack of letters rubber banded together that Elsie had written to her mother Idalia during her 30s and 40s. And in going through those letters and transcribing them, just for a moment, I started creating files for these documents, and I quickly realized that it was impossible to keep track of them all. So I found this software program called Colfax Paperport, and I got an oversized scanner so I could scan everything at a high resolution. And today I have, I have several hundred folders and over 8,000 files in those folders. And they're all, if any of you are into chronological research, the way that I learned real quick to organize them is to title everything by date, by year, by month, by day. And you always have to fill in all the fields with the zeros, otherwise they won't arrange when you get sort. So anyway, in some of the letters that I found to Idalia, my great-grandmother, Elsie inherited everything that went to the chicken house. And after Idalia died, I know I'm throwing a lot of names out there, I'll try to stay clear on it. After my great-grandmother Idalia died in the 50s, my grandmother Elsie brought all her things home. So Elsie, in effect, got back all the letters she had written to her mother decades earlier. Well, in the 60s, and from what I've read in the notes, I think she went through these decades-old letters and reread them. And by then, like I say, Idalia was dead. And once in a while, I'd find a note that Elsie, she'd use a little straight pin and pin her note to the old letter. And there was this note, and I want to read it because this is an example of how Elsie was an unreliable narrator. In Roosevelt's letter, Barbara just got a psychological disorder. Well, in this other letter, this is the year 1934, before Barbara became ill. I think you knew she was ill when you left for Seattle. Only, of course, then so little was known about psychological illness. I believe that if she could have been sent away to school, her chronic maladjustment with its tragic results with all her children might have been averted. But there was no one to know that then. How great was our loss, but it is most difficult to foresee the future when it is an uncharted course. Those who come later have the advantage of experience. As Dr. Peterson said, schizophrenia was suspected with my grandmother, or with my mother rather, with Barbara. My grandmother often wrote about Barbara being schizophrenic. When I came to the realization that I wanted to tell her mother's story, I started studying schizophrenia. And quite often, the term borderline personality disorder would pop up. And several years ago, Patty and I was flying down to visit our daughter Rachel in Arizona. and we were killing time in a little bookshop in the airport in Minneapolis, and I came across this book, Borderline Personality Disorder Demystified by Robert O. Friedel, MD. And I bought it, and by the time that plane landed in Arizona several hours later, margins were scribbled full of notes, text was underlined, and I realized that the descriptions, the symptoms that Friedel talked about in his book was exactly what Barbara struggled with. And so I started really studying borderline personality disorder. And the more I studied it, the more I realized that this is exactly was Barbara's struggle. What I would suggest, if you have the book, keep that printout I have, and I have the criteria. I paid the APA, I paid them $350 to print that out. So I can use it all I want. Anyway, it's in the book, but I would suggest keeping that list when you're reading the book, and as you read Barbara's story, each time you see a symptom, just kind of put a note or something to yourself, because there are countless examples in the book of Barbara's struggle that just fit to a T on the symptoms, the criteria. So, anyway, I could, like I say, the book covers a century, and I thought, what can I talk about without boring you? And I came to the realization that there was an incident that happened to Barbara when she was 18, just turned 19 years old. And that, Danny, you lived with Barbara, probably more years than I did, actually. But that incident I'm going to talk about, I'm going to focus on tonight, truly impacted her. With borderline personality disorder, people are more subject to getting post-traumatic stress disorder. And I feel I have the authority to talk about that because I was diagnosed with PTSD in the 1990s from my Vietnam experience. So in 1937, Elsie and her two daughters went to Europe. And the main goal was for Barbara to attend a music institute, Art Institute in Brussels, Belgium. She registered there and she spent the next 2 years there. Elsie and her daughter Polly had a 6-month visa. They came home in the spring of 1938 and left Barbara behind. Well, this summer of 1939, on July 15th, Barbara and two friends left Brussels for summer vacation, and their destination was in a little village in southern Poland. And I have in the book the story, and I interviewed Barbara. I spent quite many hours actually interviewing Barbara in her later years, and I kept notes, and she did open up quite a bit. She really mellowed out in her later years. But she explained to me how they left Brussels and they went down through France and into Spain, and again, this is all in the book, so whatever. But they went into Spain, up in the Pyrenees Mountains, and across to Italy, and she said they visited the Vatican. The two girls she was with were Catholic girls, students. They saw the Pope out on the balcony. That always impressed Barb. And we went to St. Mark's Basilica. There's a picture of them in a book at St. Mark's. But Marcel, one of the girls, left at that point and went back to France. Eva Barbaka and my mother went on to Poland, is where Eva lived. So I want to read a couple of entries here. Let's see. Okay, so if you think of your history, August of 1939, the world was on the brink of war. And here's some entries my grandmother had in her diary. Monday, August 21st, 1939. The war jitters over Poland are now the worst yet. Britain has ordered all Britons to leave Poland, Warsaw especially. We wonder whether Barb has left yet or not. I suppose we will know in a few days. the suspense is getting worse. And this is, it's kind of interesting in reading this, and when you read the book, you'll see it, how a generation earlier, you know, just 20 years earlier, basically, Europe had gone through World War II and the hell of that. And yet, here they were 20 years later on the cusp of the second great invasion, and there was complete denial. I don't know if it's just human to deny it, but here we are, August 22nd. Thank goodness word from Barb from Poland, written on the 8th. She talks about German maneuvers across the border in Czechoslovakia no more. She is having a wonderful time visiting Iva Brabaka in a fashionable resort, swimming, mountain climbing, dancing, tennis, and bridge. The headlines blaze war talk. Germany and Russia have signed a pact. So, again, if you think of your history, Hitler and Stalin signed a non-aggression pact. And that was Hitler's doing mainly to protect that side, that front. While Barb was in Poland, and again, this is part of borderline, people are very impulsive. Barbara was in Poland for 2 weeks, and she met this man, Krista Kronowka, and he proposed to her, and she accepted. Okay? On Saturday, August 26th, my grandmother wrote in her diary, a frightful shot this AM in an airmail, mailed by Barb from Poland, enclosing a letter from a young Polish engineer asking us for permission to marry Barb. Apparently, immediately. We are simply stunned. We don't know what to do. Of course, our inclination would be to cable to wait until Christmas. Think of her beautiful talent being stored away in Poland, the tension spot of the world, and apparently he owns the very oil fields Hitler wants. So can you imagine a parent's grief with that? Okay, so on August 26, 1939, Eva's father warned Barbara that she must flee Poland. He put her on a train, and Noe-Sant, she must have been frantic with worry about Eva and Krista. There is no record of her saying goodbye. Noe-Sant was less than 100 miles from where the opening shots of World War II were fired 1 week later on the night of August 31st, 1939. And so during my interviews with Barbara, she told me quite a bit, actually, about her trip from Poland back to Brussels. Her train was not derailed, but stopped and shoveled aside so troop trains could pass going toward Poland. And she really despised the Nazis, the German people. And it's sad she clustered all Germans. She considered them all Nazis. But Barbara made her way back to Brussels and on to England, and she bought passage on a ship. The name of it was the American Farmer. And just by rare coincidence, it's the same ship that she traveled to Europe on 2 years earlier. So I want to, on September 17th, okay, the title of this chapter, Bombing of the German Submarine U-53 and Kazakhstan Survivors. We grew up, Danny, do you ever remember Barb telling the stories of being bombed? Yeah. That was like a flashbulb memory, and I'm quite certain that Barbara struggled with PTSD or the comorbid issue. She would often tell this story. And, according to her, the American Farmer was en route back to the States, and his German U-boat surfaced and demanded they stop to offload British sailors that they had captured. And I thought I need to learn what happened here. So I did a fair amount of research. I actually was able to purchase an original ticker tape, okay, from a news agency. And I got an original photograph of the British survivors coming aboard the ship my mother was on. And so I want to just read a little bit here. Okay, in the late afternoon, U-53 torpedoed a British steam merchant ship, the Kafirstan, 350 miles west of Cape Clear, Ireland. The Kafirstan had been en route from Cuba to Liverpool with a cargo of sugar. The doomed ship sank slowly, and 35 surviving British merchant sailors escaped in lifeboats. The U-53 surfaced and took the British lifeboats in tow toward the Irish coast. 2 hours later, U-53 Captain Ernest Gunter Huntley hailed the American farmer and ordered them to take the British survivors aboard. And I have the ticker tape, I transcribed it, and it's in the book here. Barbara loved retelling this story during her life, and one of our last interviews I heard it again. Barbara, along with other passengers, no doubt stood on the American farmer's deck, perhaps leaning against the rail, listening as the U-boat captain issued orders. Memory is an interesting thing and not to be trusted, especially about traumatic events. According to Barbara, the American farmer lowered her lifeboats and rowed to U-53 and loaded the crewmen, the Kafirstan survivors. The loaded lifeboats were midway back when several British swordfish airplanes swooped down and strafed U-53. Barbara said the plane circled, came in low, and dropped a bomb on U-boat's conning tower. She said it sank with all hands. I think that violent confrontation became a flashbulb memory, always near the surface of her mind. On that same day, the Soviet-Russian army invaded Poland from the west. The German army was bombing Warsaw, where Barbara had been only 3 weeks earlier. The German army captured 400,000 Polish troops. Barbara's world was collapsing. Eva and Krzysztof were in the heart of Poland's destruction. So I think that was a trauma event. What actually happened, the U-boat came surfaced and took these lifeboats in tow. Okay, the American farmer did not lower the lifeboats and go to the U-boat, but the British planes did in fact come in and bomb the U-boat. It crashed, died. 6 of the British sailors drowned, and several German sailors that were topside when the U-boat crash also died. And Barbara was probably within a quarter of a mile and witnessed this. And for a young person that, especially had never seen combat before, had to be very traumatic. So she came back to the United States, and she really struggled. She attended Juilliard, and one of the stories she told us was that she had graduated from Juilliard and she worked there as a grad assistant. And I got her college transcriptions there. And in fact, she only attended 2 semesters. And she headed west. And her life was just a disaster. Through the 1940s, she married twice, got divorced, had 4 children, and it just went downhill. And it goes back to the letter that Elsie wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt. And when in about 1946, during her divorce from John Curry, the father of my 2 older brothers, Barb cut herself off from her family. I'm sure she was struggling with depression, among other things. I was at a loss trying to reconstruct her life. That's when I reached out to Las Cruces and got all this just priceless information. In one of the depositions, it was done, here's this court in Las Cruces getting depositions in New York City. And so it was all done long distance, and there's just an incredible amount of information, and it's not all in the book because it wasn't relevant to the story. But in one of the depositions, there was information that, at the time I read it, wasn't significant to me. For example, the Mae Sloan, who was a welfare caseworker, was asked for Barbara's present address, and it was Magnolia Drive, Selden, New York. And like I say, at that time, it didn't mean anything to me. But the other thing I would mention, that I thought was very significant. And I'll read this interrogatory number 14. If known to you, state her present condition of health, both physical and mental or otherwise. And May Sloan replied, as to Mrs. Curry's mental health, she appears to be a mentally unstable person. Because of this, we had her examined by a psychiatrist, Dr. George M. Lott, on August 1st, 1946. He stated that she is not mentally ill, but that she has a personality disorder, which is primarily manifested by a hostile attitude toward her parents. In her relationship with others, she has a tendency to be opinionated and obstinate. However, she is well-oriented and above-average intelligence. I guess what really impressed me that Dr. George Lott recognized this personality disorder 40 years before it was recognized as a diagnostic disorder with the APA. So I'm going to jump forward here. In 1966, I want to read just a little piece I wrote here. Okay, here we go. So okay, we're going to jump from Barbara's story to more present day here now. Since 1954, Beltrami County Welfare Department was involved in our family, okay? In 1960, Barb was committed to Fergus Falls State Hospital, and it was just for 6 months. I got her, this is people that do research, here's an interesting thing, I learned this at a workshop. I wanted to get her records from Fergus Falls State Hospital, but I thought it was impossible. And someone in this workshop suggested I contact the Minnesota State Historical Society Library, and I did. And I got Barbara's complete Fergus Falls records, including her psychiatric exam. And in there, that's in this book here, just an excerpt from it. But in the psychiatric interview, she acknowledges that the psychiatrist wrote that Barbara was married 3, and in parentheses, possibly 4 times. And that 4th husband would have been this Polish man. And I have to think that at that point, when Barbara lost all her children to the county, to welfare, all her masks were down, and she, for once in her life, was vulnerable and telling the truth, telling how it was. And so I truly believe that in the hysteria of war and everything else, she did marry that Polish guy. Anyway, so 5 foster homes, and 6 years after Sheriff removed us from the farm, the court emancipated me. This is something I just kind of learned from the court papers, and I'll just read this a little bit. May 10th, 1966, order terminating jurisdiction on Wendell George Curry for the reason that the youth has been out of the home in the service for over a year and can be considered emancipated and no longer need supervision. My class graduated from high school that month, and I was midway through my first tour in Vietnam. So I'm going to read just a couple pages here. I think back, and this is 1966, I think back to a Sunday morning, just home from Vietnam. I stand in my rumpled uniform, tired, hungry, nervous, at the front of a small ranch-style house in Las Cruces, New Mexico. The Greyhound bus ride from Long Beach, California was no doubt the same route my mother and 2 older brothers had traveled 18 years earlier, after she had abandoned me in the Los Angeles hospital when I was 2 weeks old. I knock and the door opens. John Curry, the man listed as father on my birth certificate, stares at me. Hispanic features, green hair, medium voice, medium build, low voice. He knows. Chris, he says. I shake my head no. Timothy? Again I shake my head. Wendell? I nod and he waves me in. He motioned me to a seat in the living room and sits across the room. His wife, Ella, brings us coffee, then disappears. Two inquisitive little girls peek into the room, but retreat. John chain smokes 3 cigarettes while we force small talk. Your grandmother Elsie asked me about you many years ago, he says. I know. I wrote her while I was in Vietnam and told her I'd like to meet you when I got home. She told me you lived in Las Cruces and thought perhaps you still did because your parents lived here. I got your address from the phone book, I replied. My parents are both dead, John says. A lifetime of taunts and innuendo prompt me to ask, are you my father? Why do you ask? Because you're listed as father on my birth certificate, but Chris and Tim look different than me and have always teased me, I explained. I will not impugn your mother's honor. John snubs a cigarette, fresh lit for cigarette out, stands and calls Ella. I'm leaving for work, he says, and walks out without acknowledging me. I pick up my duffel bag and ask Ella to call me a cab. Please stay, she says. You caught him by surprise. He needs space to think. He'll be back. She takes my bag and guides me to the bedroom of one of her little girls. Ella calls John's nephew, a young man home on leave from the Marine Corps. He too has just returned from Vietnam. We drive around Las Cruces, driving and drinking and visiting his friends. After a few days, burned out and broke, I bid farewell to Ella and the girls and returned to California without seeing John. I feel hollow and angry at John's rejection of me and his disappearance. John died 11 years after my visit. His birth certificate, his death certificate, dated April 18, 1977, shows that he was 58 years old, divorced again, and living with his sister. Usual occupation, unemployed. Kind of business, none. In the box asking cause of death, I found this statement: self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. In retrospect, I wonder what kind of man would leave his wife and 2 young daughters with a stranger. Through the 1940s, Barbara had written so many untruths to her family, yet was there some veracity to her accusations about John's gambling, drinking, and not holding a job? Did he walk out on her as she claimed, just as he had done to me? Did my visit reawaken old demons and contribute to his death? I hope not. In 1940s correspondence, my grandmother wrote kindly of him. She acknowledged that it was my mother's mental illness that had destroyed the marriage. So that was kind of a setup for later in this book. In 2014, I knew that I was going to tell my mother's story, and I knew I needed to get some basic answers. Who was my father? Who was my sister's father? My sister Laurel and I had a DNA test done in 2014. And we kind of suspected we were full siblings because we both have kind of brown hair as we get old. We have kind of similar personalities, but in fact we learned that we're half siblings. Okay. The following year, 2015, we went down to Illinois and got cheek swabs, DNA samples from the 2 older brothers and submitted those. And they were full brothers. John Curry, the guy I just read about, he was their father. And so everything was registered on Ancestry.com, all 4 of our DNA samples. Well, in 2017, my sister Laurel got a call from a man named David. I'll read a tiny bit here. Laurel called me early May 2017. I received an email that there's a match for my DNA test, she told me, from a man named David who lives in Cincinnati, Ohio. And here's an excerpt from the first message Laurel received. Hello, Laurel. I am Dave, administrator for the DNA test for my sister-in-law and her mother, Grace. You show an extremely high confidence match for Grace for a close relationship such as first cousin or niece. I would like to help determine your precise relationship. And the message goes on. And we recognized a name that David put out there, Francis Xavier Schoenbach. And we knew that was a person Barbara had been married to. My oldest brother, Chris, was born in 1943. And so by the late 40s, he was 6, 7 years old, he remembered some of the names. And this person he remembered. And now this person, Frank, that was Grace's and Laura's father, is the one that was violent, I think I read. Anyway, they were divorced, and Barbara kept Laura naturally. And so I went down with Laura to Cincinnati, and I had actually been invited to be a keynote speaker in Chattanooga for a military reunion. And I was map-questing my way down there, and I thought, gee, Cincinnati's not that far out of the way. So I told Laura, pack your bag, we're going on a trip. And I dropped Laura off in Cincinnati. I spent an hour or two visiting with Grace and went down and did my business. And a couple of days later, I came back to Cincinnati and spent some time. And I met David, the man who had discovered Laura's family. And when he learned that I didn't know who my father was, he said, would you like me to look? And I was very skeptical. I thought, this guy's not going to find anything. Well, I asked David, I said, what's your background? And he sent me in a message. He says, I am indeed a biomedical scientist with a PhD in physiology and biophysics, who studied genetics as a small part of my training. He says, but I'm only a geneticist in the same way a guy who fixes his own car in a driveway is a mechanic, doing repairs in only an amateur, informal, uncertified capacity. David is a very humble person. We started exchanging messages. In 2018, he sent me a message that he was getting really close. And anyone that's interested in genealogy and studying, in the appendix, there's a 14-page message that David sent me. He's very detail-oriented. And he used a system called a mirror method. That's how he discovered my family. Okay, I won't even attempt to explain it because I don't understand it. But it's just amazing reading. So, in October of 2018, I received a message from David. Hello, Wendell, happy birthday. I am 99.99% certain that I have identified your paternal grandparents based on circumstantial data and the DNA match data and its analysis. One of the two sons was definitely your father. However, only guessing one or the other of the grandchildren can prove which son is your father and which is your uncle. I have a strong suspicion of the culprit, but no evidence. And so David did a little more research, and it's all in the book, the messages we exchanged. He sent me a printout of, like a synopsis of my 6 siblings. He said they're either your first cousins or half siblings. And it's amazing the information he sent me, and it was all public on the internet. It just was amazing. But anyway, he said, reach out to one of your new brothers. And so I studied the profile of each of my newfound half-cousins or half-siblings. And I decided to contact Louis, because Louis and I had something in common. Louis in his younger years had been on fishing trawlers in the Atlantic Ocean, and I had been on a riverboat in Vietnam. It's a real thin connection, but I thought it works. So I sent a letter to Louis, and I'll just read a couple paragraphs of it. The whole thing's in the book. January 12, 2019. Dear Mr. Creon, I recently took a genealogical DNA test through Ancestry.com and learned that my ancestors date back to Louis Grion, 1841-1921. My mother, Barbara Phillips Curry, 1920 to 2010, Was divorced with 2 young children living in Selden, Long Island when I was conceived. I was born Wendell George Curry in New York City, but grew up in Minnesota. Through a Lonely Hearts Club advertisement, Barbara met Herman Hatfield and moved her family to Minnesota in 1949. I do not think my biological father knew that I existed. Today's technology makes it possible for me to explore links to my paternal family, so I began the search. And I went on and gave a little more detail about myself and steered him to my website so that he could see who I was. And I sent him a copy of my Vietnam book, My Jungle Rivers, and that afternoon that he got my letter and my book, he called me. And when you get older, your voice gets croaky. So all my life, I knew that I might have a family out there. Louie and all my new half-siblings didn't have a clue. They were totally shocked. But it was amazing how accepting they were. It's just incredible, I guess, testament to human love. It just was amazing, the acceptance. My wife, Patty, like I say, she wasn't feeling well, and she couldn't travel out to New York with us. Louie invited me to come out, and so Laurel went with me. David, the man who made the discovery, we invited him along as kind of a gift for something that we never would have put together on our own. And we went out and spent a week with Louie and Patty. They invited us to stay at their house. We met all our siblings except Gene. Gene lives upstate New York and he couldn't make it down. Hopefully next summer when we go out there, that's going to be my first stop, and we're going to visit Gene. But some of you probably attended a history center meeting that we had when Louie and Patty came out in October of 2019 and spent a week with Patty and I. And it was we had just the most amazing visit. And again, I wrote a long letter at the end of the story here. I'll read the last paragraph of this letter I wrote to all my siblings when Louie and Patty left. And I wrote this long letter to my siblings. I said, today my vision for this book, the Barbara book, that I'm working on is to have a part 3 which will open with the 2014 DNA tests I had done and the 5-year journey that brought us together. With your permission, I would include your letters with childhood memories and maybe a few pictures about growing up with our father. I would send you each a copy of this section before getting published for your final approval. If any of you is not comfortable with the idea, I understand and will not pursue it. I look forward to hearing from you. Love you all, Wendell. Louie had shared many memory stories of our father. Shortly after I sent this letter, Larry sent me a childhood memory. And over the next few months, I received childhood memories from all my siblings, and they're part of the story. And I just really feel blessed to have connected with them. So I guess if anyone has questions, get the book, read it. It's like you say, it covers 100 years, and it's really impossible to give it justice without people falling asleep. And a long time ago, I was in a reading, and the guy said something really profound. He says, the mind will only absorb what the butt, the mind will only absorb what the butt will endure. Questions? Yes, Greg.
Wendell, I have one question for you that you don't have to answer frequently, but you have had a topsy-turvy life and incredible adventures. It's not all the way good. And yet you seem to have survived through a state of complete mental health and ability to write 4 books now. What is your secret?
That guy, you fool. You know, that's a really profound question, and I hear that question really often. Why am I the way I am? Some people think I'm a rat, but we won't go there. You know, I think a lot has to do with genetics. abilities. And I look at, you know, some of my siblings came from several different fathers, and some of them struggle with mental issues, alcoholism. I'm not qualified to guesstimate what they struggle with, but you know, one of the greatest strengths I think that was good for me is writing. I think writing is very therapeutic. In telling my Vietnam story, you know, if you go on Amazon and you look, one of the first reviews was from my daughter Rachel, and she says, she was thankful I wrote the book. She says, I'm 40 years old, and she says, this is the first time I ever heard his experience, my experience in Vietnam. And you know, that was really heartfelt for me. And Doc Peterson, as he mentioned, retired from the VA, and several years ago, he invited me to facilitate a Veterans Writers Group. And it's ongoing now for 5 years, and it's going strong. And we just got a new book titled Post-Traumatic Growth. And a couple of years ago, I was invited to speak at a mental health seminar, and I thought, oh my, an old retired butcher to talk at a mental health seminar. Anyway, I asked the therapists, a room full of therapists, how many of them incorporated post-traumatic growth concept into their therapy, and not one of them answered me. And that really surprised me. And today, that's part of my message that I like to get out when I'm speaking in public, that people who have experienced trauma, not just veterans, anyone that has experienced trauma, there is life after trauma. You just have to, writing, first of all, with writing, let me go back to that. The VA has what's called written exposure therapy, written exposure therapy. And it's a real powerful program. I strongly advocate it for veterans. But what I learned, and Jessie and I took classes many years ago, she read some of my earliest Vietnam stories. But what I learned over the years is putting trauma memories on paper, you take ownership of them, first of all. And once you start putting information down on paper, you realize your memories, the way you remember things may not be accurate, okay? And you can start rearranging and making sense of a issue, of a experience. And so that to me was huge. Later on, I went part-time to BSU for a brief 10, 12 years, focused on writing and psychology and such. But one of the grad students suggested, she said, take your stories and arrange them chronologically. I never planned on writing a book, but I did what she suggested. I was able to, the unit I was with in Vietnam has an association, Mobile Referee Force Association, and it has a really big website, and then old records, after-action reports and whatnot. So I was able to glean a lot of information from that, and that helped me arrange my stories chronologically. And so that, in effect, eventually, my Vietnam experience, I was able to kind of work it into my total life experience, if that makes sense. And I think writing Pawns, like the book that I had done a couple of years ago, it's about our growing up with Bart and going through the foster care system. Writing that book, and again, there were so many primary source documents from the Chicken House supporting those stories. Again, just putting those stories on paper and those memories helped make sense of my childhood. And I think it opened the door to explore Barbara's life. Kind of a long-winded answer. Other questions?
Do you facilitate writing classes for people other than veterans? For post?
You know, I haven't. I've been invited to. I did a research workshop not long ago at the library, and I guess we're gonna do another one. Deb McGregor asked me about maybe doing a workshop for post-traumatic growth. So I think I'm gonna visit with Deb about that, because she's kind of works with that too. Other questions? Hey, Chef. Wow, I answered them all. If some of you know Emily Anger, Emily and I have been working together, and she's just an amazing helper. So she has a few words.
Thank you everybody for coming tonight. I've been working with Wendell, I do some book marketing, and so within that, what I'm helping to set up something called a book launch team. What that entails is people who buy the book and like it and want to get the book out to their friends about this book. You get to be part of kind of a short 3-week online book club that we do together. So if that sounds like something that you would like, I'm going to be at the front desk. You can ask me questions. It's basically a private Facebook group where we read the book together over the next 3 weeks. There'll be some fun prizes that Wendell has that he's going to share with you guys, and there'll be a couple Zoom-style book club discussions and just some fun stuff. And then in return, we hope that you guys write good reviews of the book online and on social media and share with your friends. So if that sounds like something you want to do, if we can get enough people signed up, we're going to do it. So just come chat with me at the front desk. Otherwise, thank you all for coming tonight. This ends our program, but if you want to chat with Wendell, he'll still be in the back signing books.